By 7 p.m. on October the 5th, or day 2 of the entire nationwide invasion, within the battle unfolding within the national grasslands, which would be the last major battle within a series of battles within the DFW metro area campaign, an air assault battalion from the active duty 83rd Air Assault Brigade, which was part of the PLA's active duty 83rd Group Army, which itself, the vast majority of which was fighting a separate battle in the Houston metro area, had been attached to the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army for the purposes of providing a massively highly mobile force to this particular operation, as the 59th Ready Reserve Group Army did not possess any air assault capabilities. Its most mobile forces consisted of its ground-based 59th Special Operations Battalion and its 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, which were wheel-based forces and could move relatively faster than the track-based elements throughout the rest of the Group Army, as the air assault forces were much faster and more mobile than these wheel-based assets. These forces played a massive role in the capture of objectives, as well as the cutting off of retreat and reinforcement from different American units, and also were now partaking in a massive assault wherein they completely had the massive element of surprise, striking in the heart of the national grasslands in the middle of enemy-held territory, whereupon they would fan out and crush the enemy, as well as also conduct patrols through the area, effectively search and destroy operations, as the battle would taper off from a major combat operation to a search and destroy mission, as at the time, at 7 p.m., heavy fighting was still going on in the northeast of the national grasslands, as the H-20 heavy stealth strategic bomber flying over the area at this time, as 5 minutes prior to 7, would begin to drop its enormous payloads immediately to the south of the northeastern quadrant of the battle space. They would carpet munition an area that was 3 miles in length north to south and over a half a mile in width, effectively 3/4 of a mile in total width, as these munitions had a wide spread, with each one having a destructive radius of 275 meters, which was simply massive, as these 1,000-pounders were enormously destructive, especially when dropped in massive quantities by the heavy strategic bomber aircraft, which consisted of the H-20 stealth strategic bombers and also the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, which could drop massive amounts of these 1,000-pound munitions, as also the strike aircraft, the JH-7, could likewise drop a huge quantity of air-to-ground ordnance, as they could carry nearly 20,000 square pounds of these punishing munitions payloads, and the fighter aircraft, although they could carry much less, could still carry enough to be highly destructive, especially in terms of an entire squadron of aircraft carrying air-to-ground payloads, as the J-11 fighter squadron and the J-10 fighter squadron would also partake in these operations, primarily being loaded with precision ordnance, as in laser or Baidu, which was satellite-guided munitions, to drop them precisely onto targets below, while the JH-7s, although they could easily carry these types of ordnances that were precision-guided munitions, they would be carrying free-fall munitions for the most part on special racks that would give them a wide spread when conducting dive attacks, as well as also napalm canisters and even cluster munitions to effectively spread as widely as possible to destroy as many forces on the ground as possible in these nasty, savage air attacks. As the troops on the ground also had heavy support from artillery assets, which included the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's artillery battalion of PCL 181 howitzers, which were 155 millimeter wheel-based, highly mobile howitzer systems these very effective platforms would deliver enormous quantities of shells from the 56 total howitzers that made up this battalion's firing batteries, as also returning by 7 p.m. would be the attack helo gunships of the Air Assault Battalion from their combat aviation company, which effectively were the state of the industry, state of the art Z-10 attack helo gunships, as also the transport aviation company of the battalion, having had now dropped off all 5 ground-based companies by 5 p.m., would now be returning to conduct medevac operations as well as resupply operations, as they would bring in copious amounts of 82 millimeter mortars to be utilized by the mortar company within the Air Assault Battalion to give heavy and precise mortar support to the maneuvering troops on the ground of the Air Assault Infantry companies, as also, again, there would be also support from the PLA Strategic Missile Forces, as 2 of the 3 available brigades, as the 616th, which was a Trojan unit that appeared and materialized from their CCP regime properties at the opening of the invasion in eastern Texas, was busy firing their tactical ballistic missile systems elsewhere at this time, while the 612th and 613th, which were reinforced brigades, as they now had called up reserve battalions in addition to the active duty battalions, which comprised the brigades ordinarily with their newer and more advanced missile systems. The reserve battalions would fire older, albeit very effective systems, which were put in storage and maintained over time specifically for their use, such as the DF2A tactical ballistic missiles, which carried a 3,300-pound payload of ordnance, as well as also the even longer-ranged and even more powerful DF3A, which carried a 4,700-pound warhead of conventional ordnance, nearly 5,000 pounds of payload. These punishing missiles were absolutely devastating. There would also be one of the active duty battalions within the Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the 613th firing 2 DF-21As in support of this operation, although they carried much less of a payload than the older but very destructive DF-3As and DF-2As. These 1,350-pound payloads were more than enough to cause enormous destruction against this campsite of 130 personnel, as these had an even longer range, however, and more accuracy than the DF2As and DF3As. They were still plenty enough destructive for the purposes of this operation. There would also be a DH-10A long-range subsonic cruise missile fired with its 1,200-pound payload at this campsite as well. And even from the San Antonio battle space, as there were 2 JH-7 squadrons that were orbiting that particular area, one armed with the very long-range standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles, the AFK-98s, which could, as they fired a nearly 300-mile distance from the San Antonio battle space to this area, could fire over twice that distance, as they had an even longer range. The JH-7 San Antonio that fired a pair of these missiles would strike this campsite, as well as also DF-2A strikes and a heavy airstrike from a JH-7, and even an additional JH-7, having had fired the medium-range standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles, the KD-88s, which had a over 100-mile range, having had effectively circled outside of the battle space to fire south into the national grasslands to hit this large campsite of 340 personnel. As the JH-7 strike from this particular JH-7 would drop 12,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as well as 4 napalm canisters, which would light the area ablaze and burn many people alive, that also would be struck by the heavy explosive power of the 1,000-pounders. Mortars would also strike this parking lot, as an additional 4,000 pounds from this aircraft would be dropped into the parking lot area as well and destroy this particular restroom facility. And also, the mortars that would strike would be coming from, again, the mortar company of the Air Assault Battalion, as they would destroy these technicals as well as the 4,000 pounds of munitions that would be dropped into the area. And the artillery support as well would be massive. And the attack helo gunships returning would effectively save their rocket pods and ATGMs for strikes elsewhere, as they would primarily utilize their 25mm chain gun or cannon to fire at targets below to support their troops on the ground, which had effectively, as they moved into the area and arrived by 7 p.m., had fanned out into two crescents. One crescent effectively in the south facing west, effectively, with another platoon and another crescent in the north facing south, with their third platoon moving down the center to have interlocking fields of fire with each of these crescents, as this tactical movement would be immensely effective. Even a Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drone would partake in supporting the forces on the ground, as this grouping was fleeing from being assaulted by these two squads on this hilly terrain, firing down at them. They would lose another grouping to heavy artillery strikes, as well as heavy artillery strikes into this campsite containing 200 armed combatants, as well as the DF3A strike, which was simply gargantuan. There would also be artillery strikes on this fleeing technical full of combatants that would be struck by an HE shell from the artillery fired from the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's Artillery Battalion of PCL 181 howitzers, as the HE-155 shells would splash throughout this area. They would destroy two additional technicals and a small grouping of personnel on foot. A 5-man grouping of personnel would flee temporarily the battle space and be hunted down later. For the time being, this 1.5 mile area by 1 mile area, 1.5 east-west, 1 mile north-south, would be completely inundated with this massive array of firepower. It was effectively a spectacular gathering of coordinated fires, all coordinated through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, through the gargantuan PLA ISR apparatus, picking targets, as the quadcopters of the troops on the ground were running circuits all throughout the battle space, mapping it all in real time, in addition to the high altitude assets doing the same, as they were the eyes and ears of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to be able to put together this immensely effective amount of strike packages for the strategic missile forces and also for the aircraft and even the artillery forces, also all the way down to the mortar forces. And as the attack helo gunships returned, they would have a wide array of targets to fire upon with their 25mm chain gun or cannon, as the quadcopter assets now running circuits through the area provided real-time feedback to the combat data links that were in the hands of each and every squad level NCO and above. They could direct their forces and their fire more effectively than was ever before even possible. Although there would be KIAs in this particular operation among the PLA forces, the fighting would be fanatical and savage on the part of the PLA. And although the partisans, having had been surprised by the opening of this operation, would put up the best fight they could considering all that they were up against, as the H-20 heavy stealth strategic bomber aircraft had completely annihilated in the east of the area from off the map here and down this 1.5 mile map by 1 mile map, 3/4 of a mile spread of the munitions all the way down and off map where the last munitions were dropped would cover a 3 mile by 3/4 of a mile area, smashing all of these campsites to complete and total oblivion, as this grouping of 278 in this camp would be completely gone. This grouping trying to flee along the roadside would be gone. These vehicles trying to flee would be gone. This group gone. 105 completely gone. 150 gone. 340 gone. And 290 gone, plus this grouping here trying to flee. Groupings on the outer periphery that would not be destroyed in the heavy saturation of 1,000-pound munitions would be struck by HE shells fired by the artillery of the Artillery Firing Battalion belonging to the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade. As in this area, this sizable grouping would be pounded by repeated HE shell strikes, as with this grouping on the eastern side of this particular map. The carpet munitioning was completely and totally savage, as operationally speaking, the ability to put together this sheer amount of firepower from all of these different platforms and have it so well coordinated was an act of the real-time AI battlefield data processing system and very brilliant commanders all the way at the group army level in the headquarters of headquarters battalion, as the AI advised them on everything. These very intelligent commanders also were very effective at leading their forces, and with the boost given to them through the AI system, made these forces so powerful that they by far were the deadliest fighting forces in the entire world. As the heavy fighting was now underway, as one of 3 combat platoons of the 2nd Air Assault Infantry Company of the battalion, as one company was still fighting in the northeast by 7 p.m., as the fighting in the northeastern quadrant of the battle space would effectively end by 8:30, leading to this first company of Air Assault Infantry fanning out and effectively holding their gains and watching the peripheries of the northeastern quadrant before they would then conduct search and destroy operations a bit later in the battle, as again, the heavy assault would taper off into patrols and search and destroy missions by roughly 9:30 p.m. going into 11:30. But for now, the fighting was savage and massively destructive, as this vast array of platforms and firepower laid waste to a massive area. And 7,000 non-combatants would also perish in the strategic air raid over this area, being utilized in a more tactical manner to assist the ground troops in their overall combat operations, as there would be 1,350 armed combatants in this area completely annihilated with 7,000 non-combatants. That would assist massively in the mopping up of all resistance in this particular area, as again, 1,050 were completely destroyed in this area alone, which was the initial landing zone site chosen to kick off the operation, as it was effectively smack in the middle of the national grasslands, in the heart of where the American defenders had effectively decided to set up camp throughout this area. And many campsites in the initial landing zone area were completely and totally eradicated by the H-6K heavy strategic bombing, as well as also even artillery assistance rendered all the way to the northwest from the 77th Group Army's PHL-16, or also known as the A-300 Battalion, with one of their firing batteries firing the miniature shorter range tactical ballistic missiles known as the BRE-8s, or Fire Dragon tactical ballistic missiles, which were 750 millimeter missiles and were very punishing weapons, carrying 1,000-pound payloads to destroy this campsite, along with also 2 J-11 fighters from the J-11 squadron allocated to the DFW battlespace, dropping a pair of precision-guided 1,000-pound munitions on this area as well. As the Taculo gunships had also moved in to secure the LZ, they laid down heavy fire on American forces on the ground, and thus, after expending large quantities of ammunition, had done their RTB to effectively rearm, refuel, and do any needed maintenance, and were now returning from their CCP regime property, which contained the vast majority of their logistical support, as not yet all of their logistical support had been moved from there to the new forward operating base, which is why they had to conduct logistical operations in the CCP regime property upon where they originated at, and now were returning to support the fighting that was now going on to the south and southwest of the original landing zone area. As the mortar company, as the fighting in the northeast had been going on for an hour before they had fully set up their FDC tent, as well as also brought in a significant quantity of mortars from the resupply operation being conducted by the Transport Aviation Company, now having had effectively set up their firing platoons, with one facing south and southwest and another now fanned out facing north and northeast, they could render enormous mortar fire support to the ground troops that were operating within this area. Again, PLA troops would fight very hard in this entire operation, as these quasi-elite troops were the best possible troops to utilize in such a surprise operation in terms of ground forces, as they were the most mobile forces on the entire map. But they would have some casualties in this particular battle in terms of KIAs, as the fighting in the northeast would only see some minor WIAs, as in limb wounds, as some would take hits in their limbs. The Transport Aviation Company would utilize its Z-20 utility helicopters in medevac roles in addition to their resupply logistical role, and would effectively, by 7, move in to the northeast to pick up the WIAs in that particular combat operation in that particular zone of the national grasslands. As the fighting in the south and southwest was well underway at this point, 20 of the 48 fired loitering munitions from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion from the 24th Light Infantry Brigade that was holding the destroyed Naval Air Station had fired a volley of 48 from their headquarters and support company's combat drone section, with 20 moving into the northeast of the battle space to assist the fighting going on in that quadrant, which was happening at the same time as the operation begun in the southwest, as again this would not be over until 8:30 p.m. officially, leading into the search and destroy operations. The fighting in the southwest would go on from 7 p.m. until 9:30 p.m., which would then lead into this company conducting its search and destroy operations, which would unfold a bit further south, as this lake area in the southwest was effectively a border for the vast majority of the armed combatants that were immediately to the southwest of the initial landing zone, while there would still be some to the south of this area on the outer periphery of the national grasslands, as one campsite to the south would be struck by a DF-3A and completely annihilated, leaving others that were wandering through wooded areas to have to be hunted down after this fighting had concluded. The other two ground-based air assault infantry companies were now patrolling other parts of the national grasslands, as all 5 companies, including the mortar company, had been landed in the LZ, which was secure by 5 p.m. with all having been landed. One air assault infantry company would move to the north and west. Another would move more south, as the heavy strategic bombing would cover a massive area, after which that company would then fan out to the east and patrol the eastern periphery, while the first company had moved into the northeast to seize control of that area and sweep it of enemy personnel, while the last company had moved to the south and west, with the mortar support now coming in heavy, as again, they were supplied with all the mortars they needed for this operation and had set up their FDC tent, and now could conduct highly efficient, highly effective mortar support operations for the advancing troops on the ground as this platoon, again, moved down the center of the battle space, heading in a southwesterly direction towards the lake to completely cut off all enemy forces with fields of fire that could interlock to completely control the area through fields of fire. As these forces here had tried to flee the battle space, they were relentlessly hit by mortar strikes, as 82mm mortars had begun to rain down upon them, as they were also being fired at by this squad of this platoon of air assault infantry fanned out on the very western end of the battle space, as they exchanged fire very briefly before the mortar support had begun to come in, as well as also fragmentation warhead-equipped loitering munition strikes that had annihilated this grouping of over 15 personnel. As the combat medics would be relatively busy during this operation, tending to the WIAs and KIAs, trying to pull them out of the area to be evacuated by the Z-20 utility helos of the Transport Aviation Company. There would be, in this platoon, there would be 5 KIAs among the PLA troops, as this squad here would suffer 2 KIAs, this squad would suffer 2, and this squad would suffer 1 in the short exchange of fire between this grouping here. As this grouping had tried to break out of the area, interlocking fields of fire had effectively cut them down, effectively, along with loitering munition strikes that were coming into the battle space, as one would even hit this boat, which was a fishing boat, with 4 personnel within it that were trying to effectively get across the lake and get out of this area, as the fighting had become more intense and the tactical ballistic missile strikes and airstrikes had kicked off, including the 2 KD-88s fired at this camp, with the massive quantity of air-to-ground payloads dropped on this area of 340 personnel, completely and totally eradicating this entire campsite, and with artillery smashing these forces trying to flee the area, and mortars support coming in against this grouping here, as these squads, with their interlocking fields of fire, laid down heavy fire on this grouping of personnel, as these troops were in the prone position, as in laying down facing the enemy forces, and utilizing terrain features to the best possible effect, as in utilizing the terrain variations, as the topography was somewhat varied, although very mildly in this area here, to their best advantage to take cover from the fire now being levied upon them from these forces. Although again, they would have 2 KIAs, that these 2 personnel would each be effectively shot in the head, and thus would result in KIAs. Combat medics were trying to pull them out and then return to tend to wounded personnel, as there would be a few critically wounded as well that would need to be evacuated via the Transport Aviation Company's C-20 utility/transport helos, as these squads, despite having lost 5 personnel between all squads of the platoon, all 5, would still be highly combat effective, and this would not effectively deter the operation as it was unfolding. This squad would bound slightly ahead to make the crescent a bit more facing inward, and would assist in laying down fire on these personnel here, as well as also levying fire against these personnel from their new position, as the half the squad, or 5, would fire in this direction, and the other half would fire down in this direction upon reaching this point by this small wood line. And mortar support would come in to support the advance of this platoon moving straight down the middle, who could fire on both sides with having interlocking fields of fire with the 2 crescent-shaped platoons who had taken their time moving into position, as again they were on foot, and by 7 p.m. they were in position and ready to launch this major assault. Again, the Americans lacked ISR capabilities. They had no idea that PLA troops were moving into place, having had moved south from their LZ and also moved to the west and then south from their LZ positions, and also moving straight through the area as they moved through the mortar company's effective setup of their firing platoons and their headquarters platoon, and each platoon had its own FDC tent, the other 10 on the other side. They now moved straight through the area with combat medics to support them in this operation, as this Wingling 2 dedicated combat drone would fire 4 HJ-10 missiles at this grouping trying to flee the area, as mortar strikes would come in as well, as the mortar fire, again, was very heavy in this particular sector of the National Grasslands and would remain so until the fighting had officially stopped in this particular area. There would be a KIA among the leading squad of the platoon, as well as 2 critically wounded, and the combat medics following behind would have to medevac them, as the utility helicopter for the medevac would come in and pick up these several personnel and fly them out of the area back to the hospital set up by the 59th Support Brigade of the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army, who had also tended to the logistical sites for the earlier advance through the area of the group armies of 7 through 13, and also operated again a field hospital, as they had an entire medical battalion, which was the chief medical force of the entire group army, as the medics aboard the medevac flights of the Z-20s would effectively stabilize the critically wounded until they had arrived at the field hospital that was tended to by the elements of the 59th Support Brigade. These utility helos made a massive difference in saving lives throughout the course of the combat operations in this particular sector, and now even other sectors of the fighting, as they remained on standby from all air assault battalions, when not in use for air assault operations, to conduct medevac flights, as they even partook in the fighting in the Irving Pocket to medevac troops of both the 35th Armored Brigade and 16th Infantry Division fighting in that battle, who were critically wounded, as the squads in this crescent would, on the southern end of it, slightly shift positions as this grouping was moving up from the south. They would effectively have staggered weapons in this squad here, as they had their ISR assets running circuits throughout the whole area. They're mapping it in real time. They had seen these forces moving up from the south and would engage them immediately with heavy volumes of fire, while this squad would cover down on their position slightly as this squad moved a bit further south. And this squad would lose one of their personnel to the heavy fighting with this grouping here moving through this area, as these squads had interlocking fields of fire, but they had staggered weapons and then shifted fire against these forces. This was a heavy fight, but because they had ISR dominance and total ISR superiority over the battlefield, they were able to rapidly shift fire between this grouping and this grouping as needed, as this squad, and this squad all had the ability to fire upon these personnel. This is about 25 personnel that had fled from the destruction and the savagery of this campsite being totally annihilated by a very powerful DF-3A with its nearly 5,000 pounds of munitions, and also the heavy artillery fire from 155 millimeter shells destroying this campsite, in addition to the missile strike. These personnel in this position of this grouping fleeing, as the artillery destroyed these personnel here from the horrible shelling in this area, as well as this whole grouping, these personnel here had perished from fire being levied down upon them from this higher ground from these two squads on the northern end of this crescent of this platoon. And as the attack helo gunships returned, they contributed enormously to the support against these forces, and these forces with their 25 millimeter chain guns, as again, it was not uncommon in this campaign or any of the campaigns throughout the entire invasion for multiple different platforms to hit the same target at nearly or at the same time, as these forces levied down fire on this grouping, and the chain guns from the returning combat aviation companies Z-10 attack helo gunships were also being utilized at this time against these forces, again saving their even more powerful 70mm rocket pods and ATGMs for later use, as they would be highly efficient and effective during the search and destroy operations to support the ground troops who would conduct these operations from the air assault infantry companies. For the time being, the gunships, again, would mainly stick to utilizing their 25mm chain guns or cannon, as these were very destructive with HE armor-piercing ammunition, which blasted sizable areas, especially when used in concentrated form from the multiple gunships. They effectively aided in suppressing all of these forces, as well as also the mortar strikes, the ATGM strikes from this Wing Wing 2, firing 4 HJ-10s at what was even left of this group, as the 82mm mortars came in, as well as also the 25mm chain gun fire from the returning gunships, as these forces were also laying down heavy fire on them as well from this platoon. The tactical vectoring of firepower, including the support from the gunships with their 25mm cannon, as well as ATGM strikes, mortar strikes, was all too much to bear. As this battle lasted from 7 to 9:30, the duration of the battle being 2.5 hours was mostly due to all the foot-based forces, both the PLA forces as well as also the armed reactionary civilian elements, taking ample time on foot to move and shift positions, which had effectively slowed down the battle somewhat, as the armed reactionary civilian elements were a diverse grouping of different forces. Some of them had more standardized weaponry, as some of them were small militia-type forces that were tight-knit groupings of different personnel, but in small numbers, and they had military patterned equipment, whether it was Kevlars or plate carriers or body armor of different types, all the way to armed civilians that came in their street clothes and barely had any ammunition for whatever weapons they carried into battle, whether it be sporting rifles, which were military patterned rifles, or hunting rifles, or shotguns, which were a horrible choice for this type of high intensity combat, especially at distance, and also pistols, which were effectively very ineffective against these PLA forces. PLA forces had outstanding body armor, and it could repel most of the ammunition types being utilized against them by the armed reactionary civilians, as well as also the U.S. military, unless they were using larger caliber weapons like 50 caliber ammunition. These forces were well equipped, and they had excellent firepower dominance, with not just their light machine guns and some general purpose machine guns, which some of the squads carried into battle, and also their very capable QBZ-95 rifles, as the QBJ-201 light machine gun had an exceedingly high rate of fire and was a devastating weapon. They also had their rocket-propelled grenades with anti-personnel rounds, which were fragmentation rockets. They had their man-portable ATGMs, such as the HJ-08s. They also had hand grenades and 35mm tube-fired grenades at their disposal. All of this firepower, especially utilized in efficient tactical formations, was far too much to contend with for the sloppy nature of the maneuvering of the armed reactionary civilian elements. Again, they all ranged from very poor to excellent in terms of their capabilities, training, and tactical knowledge, as the vast majority of the armed civilians had no tactical knowledge but were trainable. There were still some that did effectively have some degree of tactical capabilities in terms of their movements as groups and tactical formations. But for the most part, again, these armed civilians were not prepared, and the first lieutenant, or the former XO of the rifle company, having had been destroyed defending the naval air station as he had escaped through a myriad of sewage and drainage tunnels and then wooded areas as he escaped the built-up urban settlement of the DFW Metroplex heading to the national grasslands, again had a tall order ahead of him to train and organize and logistically prepare the armed reactionary civilian elements, and he was working on it at the time of this assault and would never be able to achieve this goal, as the air assault, with its heavy surprise and its gargantuan support from the PLAAF, as well as also from the strategic missile forces and its own mortar capabilities and gunship capabilities, and of course the heavy artillery support from the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's Artillery Battalion of PCL 181 155mm howitzers. Again, all of this was vastly too much firepower to contend with for the armed civilian forces on the ground, and it was all highly concentrated and even included loitering munitions and dedicated Wingling 2 combat drones. With this one firing two HJ-10 ATGMs 5 miles away from this battle space, even over this area, and into the area that was carpet munitioned, as there would be small groupings after the carpet munition that would attempt to pass through the area, but again, small groupings like this would be savagely hunted down after the main combat operations had unfolded. As this vehicle was desperate to get out of the area, it had shifted positions multiple times, trying to race into this area, only to be hit by two ISR, real-time AI battlefield data processing system, directed mortars through the FDC of the mortar company, with providing them with excellent coordinates and high degrees of accuracy in terms of their fire. They completely wiped out this technical full of 5 personnel with their 2 mortar strikes that were vectored into the area. This after the massive airstrike from the very powerful JH-7 passing over the area, as well as also the 2 DF-2A strikes, the 2 AFK-98 strikes, and the artillery strikes had effectively reduced the area to complete and total oblivion. These forces, shifting positions multiple times, would end up engaging the lead squad of this platoon after it formed into a wedge formation and moved into this area. There would be a heated exchange of fire from across the road at one another, as heavy firepower would be laid down by the PLA forces against the shoddy firepower available to these armed reactionary civilians, as there was only a small handful of them with any type of rifles. The rest had pistols and shotguns, and at this range of fire, the pistols and shotguns were quite poor in the exchange, and these forces were completely wiped out, causing no remaining casualties to the lead squad of this platoon, as most of their casualties had occurred early on as they were at this point, at this position, moving to the south. As they got here, again, they had their medevac occur, where the several WIAs had been pulled out and 1 KIA, and continued their movement south. They had already eradicated these forces, as half their squad, while still in a staggered column formation, fired in this direction, with the other half firing in this direction, as all squads were conducting that type of firing as they vectored their fire in 2 different directions to have interlocking fields of fire with the other platoons, including this platoon facing south, having the ability to vector fire in 2 directions, as they could cover a massive area between all of these platoons, these 3 platoons, and their comprising squads. As again, the gunship and mortar support was heavy, along with the artillery fire, tactical ballistic, and even cruise missile strikes, as DH-10 would strike the same campsite these 2 DF-21As had struck from one of the active duty battalions within the 613th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade. As these were newer, more advanced, longer range missiles, they carried a slightly smaller payload than did the older but highly powerful and still capable DF-2As and DF-3As, as these only carried a 1,300-pound payload, but were still plenty enough to destroy this campsite of 130 personnel along this tributary here in this wooded area. This massive JH-7 strike against this campsite, along with the missile strikes, including the DH-10A strike, completely annihilated all personnel beneath the aircraft as 4 napalm canisters, 4 1,000-pounders were initially dropped together, followed by an additional 8,000 pounds of payload, which splashed all throughout this area and annihilated everything, including this grouping trying to pass through while the small group had escaped. This technical and this grouping here, as they try to move south on the road, would be pounded heavily by repeated 155 millimeter HE shell strikes, as this campsite would be hit by multiple repeated 155 shell strikes as well, HE strikes mostly, and some DPICM ammunition, as the gunships and artillery strikes had wiped out some of these personnel and more as they proceeded into this area, in addition to the fire coming from the squad, the mortar strikes, the HJ-10 strikes. Again, the firepower and the concentration thereof was simply enormous. The fighting that occurred on this side of the advancing platoon happened at the same time as this, so the firefight was very savage. And these firefights, although relatively short, still all combined lasted a lengthy amount of time in combination with all of the actual foot movements of the dismounted forces, which again included the PLA dismounts and, of course, the American armed combatant dismounts operating in this area. As the medivacs that had occurred in this area, as they had lost a soldier and had several other wounded, would again save lives and also be able to remove the KIAs from the battle space. And also there would be an LZ up here for the Z-20 utility helos to pick up the WIAs and KIAs. These squads within these 3 platoons, these combat platoons of the Air Assault Infantry Company in this area, were still highly combat effective, as all in all, with all their losses spread out among all 3 platoons within the different squads, effectively was a drop in the bucket, although it was a huge deal to the troops involved as they lost comrades in this fighting. Effectively, it made little difference, as the victory would still be decisive over this massive number of American armed combatants, which within this map, all in all, was 1,550 armed combatants, as all combined with all the different campsites and all the dismounts, this was a sizable grouping of combatants, as effectively they were vastly outnumbering the PLA troops that came to attack them, as this PLA combat company of air assault infantry numbered just over 150 total troops, and they were up against 10 times that many armed combatants. But due to the immensity of the gargantuan available firepower in this operation from within their own battalion, which included again their mortar company, as well as also their combat aviation company, with all of the artillery support from outside of the battle space, as well as also all of the air power available to support the operation, ensured that these troops could never fail in their mission. Again, these were also quasi-elite troops. They were highly efficient as fighting forces, and their mobility and achievement of total surprise in this operation ensured that they would have somewhat of an easy victory, as they effectively lost the highest number of their troops within this particular battle unfolding by the lake here. But they, upon having secured this entire area, would then be able to begin their search and destroy operations, which were to effectively unfold from 9:30 to 11:30 and would occur to the immediate south of this particular area, this 1.5 mile by 1 mile area. in terms of width and breadth, as these forces were pounded also by artillery and loitering munition strikes. There was effectively nowhere to go and no escape. Even if the escape had been temporary, these forces would be hunted down viciously by the PLA air assault infantry troops, backed up to the hilt by all manner of firepower capabilities, whether within their own battalion or from the PLAAF or strategic missile forces. As again, immediately to the south of this area, there was an additional campsite, but it had been hit by a DF3A tactical ballistic missile and completely wiped out, as it left a small crater in the area, as well as the explosion had been massive, as this carried again a nearly 5,000-pound payload. As the camp was a bit smaller than this camp, it still contained nearly 100 armed combatants, which were completely wiped out in the missile strike. As there were other spread out combatants immediately to the south of the area trying to hide to the best of their ability or escape the area, they would be vigorously hunted down by the PLA air assault infantry troops. In the next video installation of this hypothetical documentary invasion series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines, the search and destroy operations would begin in earnest as the now spread out 4 air assault infantry companies of PLA troops all throughout the expanse of the national grasslands would sweep the peripheral areas for any and all survivors. As again, the vast majority of the combatants, as mentioned in previous installations regarding the national grasslands, were located in the south and southwest, were in the center, and also in the northeast of the battle space and east, but the combination of the air assault infantry attacks in these areas, along with the heavy strategic carpet munitioning, including to secure the initial LZ in the heart of the national grasslands, had ensured that the vast majority of the 5,000 plus defenders were completely and totally annihilated by this point, and could now allow for the major combat to taper off into the patrols that would be search and destroy patrols of the air assault troops, as they would sweep the entire area for any and all survivors and either take them as POWs or completely eradicate them. As the first lieutenant was effectively still on the loose and had not yet been captured, the PLA Special Operations troops chosen for this capture operation would be shuttled in via Z-20 Hilo, instead of utilizing their own ground vehicles, for this operation to capture the first lieutenant, the former XO of the Rifle Company, having had defended the naval air station that was completely and totally annihilated at the opening of the campaign. So that was perhaps, besides the DFW International Airport, the 2 downtowns of Fort Worth and Dallas, the other major objective that had to be neutralized for the campaign to be highly successful, as it contained American naval aviation assets, as well as also 2 battalion-sized units that had to be completely and totally annihilated, including the 1st of the 204th SHORAD Battalion from the Mississippi National Guard's 66th Troop Command, as the SEAD operation was also highly important at the opening of the campaign. Now that the combat along the lake in this part of the national grasslands that was to the southwest of the center of the national grasslands, where the initial LZ had been established and secured, was wrapping up, the company, having had partaken in this operation to destroy a force that was 10 times their size, would now fold into the area and prepare to strike south, in addition to the special operations troops that would be brought in small numbers, the sniper spotter teams, and one squad of standard operators from one company of operators from the entire battalion of the Special Operations Forces. And these troops, as the ISR total dominance over the entire battle space, had discovered the whereabouts of the first lieutenant as he was even still in his army uniform, would aid them in being able to conduct this capture operation, as the first lieutenant was seen as somebody who could provide vital intelligence to the PLA forces of the goings on in this battle space. As again, human intelligence, including through interrogations, was absolutely vital to updating the knowledge of the occupation forces on any and all changes in the battle space in regards to enemy forces in terms of their concentration, their numbers, their whereabouts, etc., their capabilities. The capture of partisan leadership was absolutely vital, and the PLA absolutely preferred to take alive any type of important leadership instead of completely eradicating them, as that served no purpose to wipe them out when vital intelligence could be gleaned from them through these interrogations, as they would become POWs in this absolute total war of annihilation and subjugation. As this was New China, a Chinese colony that would be exploited to the maximum benefit for the gargantuan Chinese industrial base back home, which constantly needed fuel to operate in terms of materials. The human capital, or the American population that was to be subjugated and didn't fight back, would also be immensely valuable as labor forces for the new colonists. And even back home in factories in China, they could do the labor that the Chinese did not want to do. As this battle was now taking a turn for the worst for the first lieutenant, as he tried in vain to escape now the national grasslands, he was about to be taken by the PLA Special Operations troops, and his entourage, trying to defend him, would be completely and totally smoked by the Special Operations Forces. More to come in the next video.